Imagine being so good at guitar that Elvis Presley himself refuses to record your song unless you're the one playing on it. In 1967, that's exactly what happened to Jerry Reed. But this was just one small chapter in the incredible story of a poor Georgia boy who would go on to become one of the most versatile entertainers in American history. From inventing his own guitar style to stealing scenes from Burt Reynolds on the silver screen, Jerry Reed's journey was anything but ordinary. And by the time you hear about the secret he kept from his fans for years, you'll understand why they called him the Guitar Man. The streets of Atlanta weren't kind to young Jerry Reed Hubbard. Born in 1937 during the twilight years of the Great Depression, Jerry's family struggled to keep food on the table. His parents' separation forced him and his sister to spend time in foster homes and orphanages. Sometimes they'd bounce between 3 different homes in a single month. The constant moving meant Jerry never quite knew where he'd be sleeping next week, but he did know one thing. Wherever he went, he'd hear his mother's guitar strings calling him home. Life in foster care taught Jerry lessons that money couldn't buy. He watched how different families lived, learned to read people, and most importantly, discovered how to make others laugh even in the hardest times. These experiences would later fuel his songwriting, giving his lyrics an authenticity that couldn't be faked. While other country stars sang about hard times, Jerry Reed had lived them. Growing up in poverty shaped Jerry in ways that would later define his music. He learned to find humor in hardship, a trait that would become his trademark. By age 8, Jerry wasn't just playing guitar, he was writing his own songs. His tiny fingers would strum for hours, trying to replicate the sounds he heard on the radio. While other kids played baseball in the streets, Jerry was developing what would later become known as the claw style of picking, a technique so complex that even experienced guitarists struggled to copy it. That dedication didn't go unnoticed. His mother, seeing the raw talent in her son's hands, worked extra shifts at the cotton mill to save enough money for his first guitar. It wasn't much, just a beaten-up acoustic with worn strings, but in Jerry's hands, it might as well have been solid gold. He played that guitar until his fingers bled, then played some more. Local musicians started taking notice of the skinny kid who could make 6 strings sound like a full band. By his early teens, Jerry had already developed a style entirely his own. He'd spend hours at Atlanta's local record shops, studying every guitar player he could find. But it wasn't enough to just copy what he heard. Jerry wanted to create something new. He began experimenting with a hybrid picking technique that combined elements of traditional country, blues, and what would later be called rockabilly. This innovative approach would eventually influence generations of guitarists, though at the time, it was just Jerry trying to stand out at local talent shows. Music wasn't just an escape for Jerry, it became his ticket out. While still in high school, he started performing at local radio stations, catching the attention of publisher Bill Lowry. Jerry's unique style, a blend of lightning-fast picking and folksy humor, stood out even then. Local radio personality Cotton Carrier remembered the first time he heard Jerry play. "This kid walks in, looking like he didn't have 2 dimes to rub together, then proceeds to play guitar like nothing I'd ever heard before." At just 18 years old, something unprecedented happened. Capitol Records offered him a recording contract. For a kid who grew up in foster homes, it seemed like a dream come true. Jerry recorded his first single, "If the Good Lord's Willing and the Creek Don't Rise," with trembling hands but unwavering determination. The song showcased his distinctive guitar work and hinted at the humor that would later become his trademark. But success doesn't always come wrapped in a pretty package. Those early Capitol singles barely made a ripple in the vast ocean of country music. The industry wasn't quite ready for Jerry's distinctive blend of country, rockabilly, and humor. Radio stations didn't know whether to play him on country or rock stations. He was too country for rock, too rock for country, and far too unique for either. One program director famously told him, "Son, you need to pick a lane and stay in it." Jerry's response, "Sir, I'm trying to build my own highway." Here's where things get interesting, and where Elvis comes back into our story. After his initial recordings failed to chart, Jerry made a decision that would alter the course of country music history. He packed up his guitar and headed to Nashville. But instead of trying to make it as a performer, he took a different path. Jerry Reed became a songwriter for hire, And that's when the magic started happening. Those early days in Nashville revealed something spectacular about Jerry's talent. While his own records weren't hitting the charts, his songwriting was pure gold in other artists' hands. Gene Vincent turned Jerry's songs into rock and roll anthems. Brenda Lee took his lyrics and made them dance across the airwaves. Even as he worked behind the scenes, Jerry was developing a reputation as the guitarist, the guy other musicians would call when they needed something special. The Nashville of the early 1960s was changing, and Jerry found himself right in the middle of it all. The slick, polished Nashville sound was giving way to something raw, more authentic. Jerry's innovative guitar work and distinctive writing style perfectly captured this shifting musical landscape. Studio musicians would gather around whenever he picked up a guitar, studying his finger movements, trying to figure out how he created those impossible sounds. And that reputation, it was about to catch the attention of the biggest name in music. But before we get to how Elvis Presley changed Jerry Reed's life forever, we need to talk about the moment Jerry discovered his signature sound, a style so unique that guitars would never quite sound the same again. Speaking of that signature sound, imagine walking into RCA Studios one day to find Elvis Presley refusing to record until you showed up. But the reason behind the King's insistence reveals something about Jerry Reed that would change country music forever. Remember that guitarist Elvis wouldn't record without? Well, the King's stubbornness was about to catapult Jerry Reed from Nashville's best-kept secret to country music's newest sensation. The year was 1967, and Jerry had written a song called Guitar Man. Elvis heard it on the radio and immediately wanted to record it. But when his own band couldn't capture Reed's unique guitar sound, Elvis made an unprecedented demand. Get me Jerry Reed. Walking into RCA Studios that day, Jerry found himself face-to-face with Elvis Presley. The King looked at him and said, "Lord Jerry, I've tried to cut this song twice, and I can't get it. Show my band how to play this." Jerry's response? He picked up his guitar and simply said, "Well, King, we're going to have to get rid of everybody except your drummer. It's just going to be you, me, and the drummer." And that's exactly what they did. The session that followed became legendary in Nashville. Jerry's fingers flew across the strings, creating a sound that even Elvis's acclaimed TCB band couldn't replicate. The King was so impressed that he kept Jerry in the studio for hours, picking his brain about guitar techniques and songwriting. By the end of the day, Elvis had not only recorded Guitar Man, but had also decided to cut U.S. Mail, another Reed composition. As Jerry later recalled, Elvis could have had any guitarist in the world, but he wanted that specific sound. Sometimes being different pays off. These Elvis sessions opened doors, but it was Jerry's own musical innovation that kicked them down. His breakthrough moment came with Amos Moses, a quirky tale about a one-armed Cajun alligator hunter. The song showcased everything that made Jerry unique: his incredible guitar work, his storytelling ability, and that infectious sense of humor. It reached number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, proving that country music could cross over without losing its soul. People who'd never listened to country music found themselves humming along to Jerry's catchy hooks and laughing at his clever lyrics. Jerry's guitar technique was so revolutionary that other musicians would gather at his shows just to watch his hands. His claw-style picking involved using his thumb for bass notes, while his fingers played melody and harmony simultaneously. Fellow guitarist Chip Young described it as like watching someone pat their head and rub their stomach, while also juggling and riding a unicycle. This technique influenced countless guitarists, including Eric Clapton, who once said, "Jerry Reed can do with 6 strings what I need a whole band to accomplish." The recording studios of Nashville had never seen anything quite like Jerry Reed. He'd walk in with a new song, lay down a complex guitar part in one take, then crack jokes with the session musicians while they tried to keep up. His energy was infectious. Producer Owen Bradley remembered, Jerry would come up with these guitar licks that seemed impossible. Then he'd teach them to the band while telling stories that had everyone in stitches. He wasn't just making music, he was entertaining the whole room. But it was "When you're hot, that really showed what Jerry Reed was capable of. The song wasn't just a #1 hit, it became a catchphrase across America. Jerry's humor and timing were perfect, delivering lines like, "The judge had the nerve to tell me he was gonna lock me up for 20 years for shooting dice. With just the right mix of indignation and amusement, the song earned him his first Grammy Award, beating out country music royalty like Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash. During this period, Jerry was writing at a pace that seemed superhuman. His publishing company actually had to tell him to slow down because they couldn't process his songs fast enough. As his friend Waylon Jennings put it, Jerry doesn't write songs, he channels them. They just pour out of him like water from a fire hose. Each composition seemed to have its own personality, from the funky groove of The Bird to the emotional depth of A Thing Called Love, which would later become a hit for Johnny Cash. Television audiences couldn't get enough of Jerry Reed. His appearances on Glenn Campbell's Good Time Hour and The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson showed America a new kind of country star, one who could play like Chet Atkins, joke like Jerry Lewis, and charm like Clark Gable. Carson was so impressed that he made Jerry a regular guest, often letting him take over the show with his stories and songs. In the recording studio, Jerry was pushing boundaries that most musicians didn't even know existed. He experimented with different tunings, innovative microphone techniques, and even began incorporating elements of funk and jazz into his country sound. His sessions became events with other musicians dropping by just to watch him work. Guitar legend Les Paul once said, "Jerry Reed isn't just playing guitar, he's reinventing it." The country music establishment didn't quite know what to make of Jerry at first. He was too progressive for the traditionalists, but too country for the pop market. Yet somehow he managed to bridge that gap, creating a sound that appealed to everyone from truckers to college professors. His concerts became legendary for their energy and unpredictability. One night in Atlanta, he played for nearly 4 hours straight, mixing complex instrumental pieces with comedy routines that had the audience crying with laughter. But what really set Jerry apart was his ability to connect with an audience. Whether he was performing on television, in a small club, or at the Grand Ole Opry, he had this way of making everyone feel like they were in on the joke. His performances were a masterclass in entertainment, combining virtuoso guitar playing with perfect comic timing. As Waylon Jennings observed, Jerry doesn't just play for an audience. He throws a party and invites them all to join in. Speaking of parties, Jerry was about to be invited to the biggest party in Hollywood. But before we get to how a guitar-picking country boy ended up stealing scenes from Burt Reynolds, let's talk about the day Jerry Reed walked into a movie audition and changed the course of his career with just 4 words. Remember those 4 words that changed Jerry Reed's career path? Picture this. It's 1975. And Jerry's sitting in a Hollywood casting office, guitar case by his side. The casting director looks at him and asks, "Do you have any acting experience?" Jerry grins and replies, "I've been acting country my whole life." That raw honesty and quick wit landed him his first major film role in WW and the Dixie Dance Kings. But it was his friendship with Burt Reynolds that would transform Jerry from a musician who occasionally acted into a legitimate movie star. They'd met on the Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour, where their natural chemistry was instant and obvious. Reynolds, already a major star, saw something in Jerry that reminded him of himself, that same mix of Southern charm and mischievous humor. When Reynolds was casting for Smokey and the Bandit, he knew exactly who he wanted as his truck-driving sidekick. Jerry didn't just play Cletus Snowman Snow, he inhabited the role completely. The character's love of CB radio, his friendship with his basset hound Fred, and his ability to get Bandit out of trouble while cracking jokes along the way, it all seemed to flow naturally from Jerry's own personality. Behind the scenes, Jerry was doing double duty. Not only was he acting in the film, but he was also creating its musical heartbeat. Eastbound and Down wasn't just another song on a movie soundtrack. It became an anthem for truckers across America. Jerry wrote it in just 20 minutes, drawing from his experiences performing at truck stops and talking with real long-haul drivers. The song captured something essential about the American spirit, that combination of freedom, rebellion, and duty that keeps the wheels turning. The success of Smokey and the Bandit catapulted Jerry into a new level of stardom. Suddenly, the guitarist who'd played on Elvis's records was a household name. The film grossed over $300 million in today's money, and Jerry's performance was singled out by critics as a highlight. Roger Ebert wrote, "Reed has a natural screen presence that can't be taught. He's just as comfortable in front of a camera as he is holding a guitar." His chemistry with Reynolds led to more collaborations, highballing, Hot Stuff, and the Smokey and the Bandit sequels. In each film, Jerry brought something unique to his characters. He had a way of stealing scenes without seeming to try, often improvising lines that made it into the final cut. During the filming of Hot Stuff, director Dom DeLuise would often just let the camera roll while Jerry and Burt riffed off each other, creating moments of genuine comedy gold. But Jerry never let his movie career overshadow his music. Between film shoots, he was still touring, recording, and writing songs. He'd often bring his guitar to set, entertaining the crew during breaks with impromptu performances. Stuntmen, cameramen, and even caterers would gather around as Jerry picked out tunes and told stories. As one crew member remembered, having Jerry on set was like having a one-man morale boost. He made 14-hour shooting days feel like a party. This period showed just how versatile Jerry Reed really was. He could go from filming intense action scenes to recording complex guitar parts in the studio, then hop on stage for a live performance, all in the same day. His work ethic was legendary. Sally Field, his co-star in Smokey and the Bandit, once said, "Jerry never seemed to get tired. He had this endless energy that lifted everyone around him." Television embraced Jerry's newfound movie stardom. He became a regular guest host on The Tonight Show, where his quick wit and musical talents made him a favorite with audiences. He could trade jokes with Johnny Carson, perform a complex guitar piece, then tell a story about his latest movie, all while seeming completely at ease. His appearances on variety shows skyrocketed, and he even hosted his own special, Jerry Reed's Down Home, Down Under. But just as Jerry was reaching the peak of his Hollywood success, something started happening behind the scenes that would eventually force him to make a heart-wrenching decision. Speaking of decisions, wait until you hear about the night Jerry had to choose between performing at the CMA Awards and filming a crucial scene for what would become one of his most memorable movies. Remember that choice between the CMA Awards and the movie shoot? That night in 1983, Jerry Reed chose the film, but not for the reasons anyone suspected. What nobody knew was that he'd been struggling to catch his breath during performances. The bright lights and pressure of live TV terrified him, not because of stage fright, but because he didn't want millions of viewers to see him gasping for air. By the early 1980s, Jerry had been quietly battling emphysema for years. Those signature laughs and quick-witted responses that seemed so effortless, they were becoming increasingly difficult to deliver. The man who once played guitar and told stories for hours without breaking a sweat now had to carefully pace himself through every performance. The disease had started creeping up on him years earlier. Decades of chain smoking, a habit he'd picked up as a teenager in the clubs of Atlanta, were finally catching up. Between takes on movie sets, crew members would spot him ducking behind trailers, trying to catch his breath. But Jerry, ever the professional, would bounce right back on camera with that megawatt smile, never letting on that anything was wrong. His wife, Priscilla Mitchell, watched with growing concern as Jerry pushed himself harder and harder. A talented singer herself, she understood the demands of performing. She'd see him return from tours exhausted, but he'd still spend hours in their home studio, working on new songs. "Music isn't what I do," he'd tell her. "It's who I am." Even as his health declined, Jerry refused to slow down completely. The movie roles started becoming more selective, not because they weren't being offered, but because Jerry knew his limitations. He began focusing more on projects that wouldn't strain his breathing as much. Studio work became his sanctuary. In the controlled environment of a recording studio, he could take breaks when needed without letting down a live audience. But Jerry Reed wasn't about to let illness define him. He poured his energy into mentoring younger artists, particularly guitarists who wanted to learn his unique style. Brad Paisley, who'd grown up idolizing Jerry's playing, remembered visiting him during this period. He couldn't play for as long as he used to, but when he did play, every note mattered. "He taught me that it's not about how many notes you play, it's about making each note tell a story." The country music community rallied around him, though many didn't know the full extent of his struggles. Longtime friends like Chet Atkins and Bobby Bare would drop by his house, often sitting on the porch, sharing stories and picking guitars. These informal sessions became something of a legend in Nashville. Veteran musicians passing down their wisdom to the next generation. Jerry's philanthropic work during this period went largely unreported. He quietly supported various charities in Nashville, particularly those helping young musicians and children in need. Having never forgotten his own humble beginnings, he made sure to help others climbing that same ladder. One Nashville music school director recalled receiving anonymous donations for years, only learning after Jerry's death that he had been their mysterious benefactor. His relationship with his daughters, Sadina and Charlotte, deepened during these years. They saw a different side of their father, still funny and creative, but more reflective. He spent hours teaching them about the music business, sharing stories from his career, and most importantly, showing them how to face adversity with grace and humor. But even as his health continued to decline, Jerry Reed had one more surprise up his sleeve, and the way he handled his final public appearances would reveal more about his character than all his hit records combined. Speaking of those final appearances, the story of his last recording session shows exactly why they called him the greatest guitar player in Nashville, even when he could barely hold the instrument. Remember that last recording session? Picture this. It's 2006, and Jerry Reed can barely hold his guitar. His breathing is labored, and his once steady hands shake slightly. The studio is silent as he positions his fingers on the fretboard. Then, like magic, those familiar lightning-fast licks start pouring out. The session musicians watch in awe as Jerry, oxygen tank by his side, lays down a guitar track so perfect it would make players half his age jealous. This was Jerry Reed's final gift to country music, showing everyone that true greatness isn't about being at your peak. It's about giving everything you've got, no matter what. Even as his health deteriorated, he approached every session with the same enthusiasm he'd had as a teenage guitarist in Atlanta. When asked how he could still play so well while struggling to breathe, he simply quipped, "The fingers remember what the mind forgets." His induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2017 was bittersweet, coming 9 years after his passing. The honor recognized not just his music, but his revolutionary impact on guitar playing. As Brad Paisley said during the ceremony, Jerry Reed didn't just play guitar, he reinvented what was possible on the instrument. Every country guitarist today, whether they know it or not, is playing something Jerry Reed created. But Jerry's influence stretched far beyond country music. Rock guitarists like Eric Clapton and Mark Knopfler cited him as an inspiration. His claw-style picking technique became required study at prestigious music schools. Even hip-hop producers began sampling his distinctive guitar riffs. One of his final collaborations was with hip-hop artist Yelawolf, proving that good music transcends both genres and generations. In his final years, Jerry found peace in knowing he'd lived life exactly as he wanted. He told his daughter Charlotte, "I've been the same guy whether I was playing for tips in Atlanta or starring in movies with Burt Reynolds. I never had to pretend to be someone I wasn't." This authenticity was perhaps his greatest legacy, showing that success doesn't require changing who you are. When Jerry Reed passed away on September 1st, 2008, the outpouring of grief came from all corners of the entertainment world. Movie stars, musicians, and fans worldwide shared stories of how he touched their lives. Burt Reynolds, fighting back tears in an interview, said, "Jerry wasn't just the best sidekick in the movies. He was the best friend anyone could have. He made everyone around him better, as a performer and as a person." The most touching tributes came from the truckers who'd grown up with Eastbound and Down as their anthem. At truck stops across America, drivers held impromptu memorials, playing Jerry's music and sharing stories. One veteran trucker summed it up perfectly. Jerry Reed wasn't just singing about trucking, he was singing about freedom, about chasing dreams, about living life on your own terms. Today, Jerry Reed's guitar style lives on through the countless musicians he influenced. His movies continue to entertain new generations, but perhaps his most important legacy is how he lived his life, with humor, grace, and an unwavering determination to be himself. As his character Snowman would say, "That's a big 10-4. Remember that skinny kid from Atlanta who learned to play guitar to escape poverty? He didn't just escape. He soared, and he brought all of us along for the ride." And if you think Jerry Reed's story is remarkable, just wait until you hear about the country music legend who was inspired to pick up a guitar after watching young Jerry perform at a Georgia truck stop. But that's another story for another time.